Progressivism originated mostly from immigrant socialists, social gospelers, women, and muckraking journalists, and was led mostly by middle-class men and women. The most recognized goals of the progressive movement were to use the state to curb monopoly power and to improve the lives of ordinary people. The early progressive movement developed at the local and state level because the ordinary men and women who promoted the movement were especially successful in their cause in poor city areas, then spread out to larger and larger areas until eventually the movement spread to the national level. The major role that women played in progressive social reform was in the settlement house movement. This arm of the movement mimicked the earlier Republican motherhood belief, but allowed it to expand past the confines of private homes. Progressivism, due to its social concerns and reform ideas, was hand in hand with the women's movement. President Theodore Roosevelt began applying progressive principles to the national economy in order to counteract the growing ignorance of the problems that common Americans faced. The Square Deal, which incorporated control of corporations, protection of consumers, and the conservation of natural resources, helped protect the public interest by addressing issues concerning capital, labor, and the public in one legislation. Taft's policies offended progressives such as Roosevelt because they violated his campaign promises and more closely resembled the policies of old, which progressives did not feel had a place in their modernized, industrialized world. Roosevelt led a progressive revolt against Taft and openly divided the Republican Party by disregarding his previous beliefs on third terms and running for president. Republicans with old-fashioned beliefs voted for Taft, while party members with a more progressive mindset sided with Roosevelt. The key issues of the 1912 election were over the varieties of progressivism, although progressivism itself was valued by each prospective candidate. The basic principles of Wilsonian progressivism included stronger antitrust legislation, banking reform, and tariff reductions, all of which favored economic competition over monopolies. Wilson successfully reformed the triple wall of privilege made up of the tariff, the banks, and the trust by establishing the Federal Reserve Commission, by ensuring the passing of the Clayton Antitrust Act, and by passing acts to aid the common man. The basic features of Wilson's moralistic foreign policy was to avoid imperialism through such tactics as quashing Taft's dollar diplomacy. Despite his intentions, Wilson was drawn into conflict with Mexico through his beliefs by being too high-minded and exclusive for the country's own good, as in the Tampico incident where the demand for respect for Americans simply because of their nationality led to conflict. America's initial neutral response to World War I was tested by both the Allied and the Central Powers, who wanted to milk as much aid as they could from the United States. Wilson's increasingly tough policies on Germany's submarine warfare mostly stemmed from American deaths due to the German assaults. The sharp political divisions over the prospect of American entry into the war were mostly sectional. The eastern seaboard, closer to the war, wanted to join, while the Midwest and western areas of the country wanted to work towards a diplomatic peace. Wilson's progressive domestic agenda and provisionally successful maintenance of American neutrality enabled him to win a narrow victory in 1916 over the still divided Republicans by attracting crucial votes, especially from the West and Midwest. What caused America to join World War I was a combination of German acts, the Zimmermann Note, which attempted to get Mexico to join Germany against the United States, and the deliberate destruction of American ships by German submarines, which violated the 1916 Sussex Ultimatum and Pledge. Wilsonian idealism turned the war into an ideological crusade for democracy that inspired public fervor and suppressed dissent by contrasting the selfish war aims of many of the nations involved with America's supposed selflessness. America's mobilization for war largely centered on propaganda campaigns which worked to counteract any hesitation prospective soldiers had about enlisting. In contrast, however, some industrial workers were threatened with the phrase "work or fight." The country largely relied on voluntary methods over government force on the war issue through these propaganda campaigns, which portrayed the patriotic as participating in these voluntary exploits. For labor, World War I had two main effects. The first was that it caused an almost unimaginable amount of need for production, which in the long run brought about a 20% increase in pay. However, the demand for labor also allowed for companies to be especially hard-nosed in the area of labor unions, causing much strife during and after the war. Women were also affected by the war. Many female workers took up the places of the men who went off to war. This invaluable support from the home front was rewarded well politically. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, but there were very few long-term economic gains for women due to the war. Wartime America had perhaps the direst effect for African Americans. The massive northward migration to find work made by countless Southern African Americans resulted in race riots during the summer of 1919 in industrial cities such as Chicago and Detroit. America's economic and political involvement was more important to World War I than its military contribution because the prospect of nearly endless American supplies of foodstuffs, munitions, oil, soldiers, and other necessary elements for the world's first mechanized war eventually caused the Germans to give up their hopes for victory. Wilson's attempt to forge a peace based on his idealistic 14 points was greatly weakened by the political mistakes he made, such as not including a Republican politician in the peace talks in Paris, which weakened his ability to resist compromises to the plan for peace that other Allied statesmen proposed. Henry Cabot Lodge and others resisted Wilson's League of Nations by presenting 14 reservations which served to protect American rights under the Monroe Doctrine and the Constitution. Wilson's determination to remain uncompromising led to the failure of the bill because he demanded that Republicans reject the altered version. Harding's victory in the election of 1920 became the final death sentence for the League because the Republicans gave the people what they wanted: a proper end to idealism, do-goodism, and American self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. America turned towards social conservatism and normalcy following World War I because it wanted to avoid any contact with the ruined Europe in order to come to grips with the U.S. involvement in this bloody war. By isolating itself, the U.S. stimulated an economic boom, but also allowed unintentionally for the rise of extremist dictators in other parts of the world. After the Great War, the United States imposed immigration quotas in an attempt to freeze the racial composition of America as it was, causing the country to abandon the expansion of freedom and opportunity that it always prided itself on. However, cultural pluralists such as Horace Kalin and Randolph Bourne were among those who did not support restrictions on immigration. Kalin promoted the idea of ethnic diversity through promoting the U.S. as a protective canopy over different ethnic groups in order to protect their unique identity. Bourne, on the other hand, favored integration of such groups into American society to make the United States a transnationality. Prohibition, supported mostly by churches and women, represented the last sputtering breath of the progressive reform. Organized crime flourished with the advent of the black market liquor trade, causing violent gang wars and high profit margins for gang leaders such as Al Capone. Protestant fundamentalism rose in popularity during this time largely due to the advances made in various scientific fields. The Scopes trial in Tennessee highlighted the division between Protestant fundamentalism and modern science because it charged a high school teacher with including evolution in his teaching. The mass consumption economy that developed in the United States could trace its origins to the rapid expansion caused both by the war and by Andrew Mellon's tax policies. The ability to buy things on credit also contributed to the massive growth of this type of economy. The availability of the automobile also played a part in mass consumption. The radio and film industry had a huge effect on the culture of the United States, most notably in standardizing what came to be called popular culture, and causing many people to reject the old world culture of their parents and grandparents. The new, more open and more adventurous culture of the United States during the 1920s was reflected and promoted in the innovative American literature and music of the 1920s, including the Harlem Renaissance. Author F. Scott Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise came to be known as the Bible of the Young. Langston Hughes's poetry was central in inspiring the racial pride that prompted the Harlem Renaissance. Jazz music, which was likewise involved in the Harlem Renaissance, grew in popularity because of its fun-loving and carefree characteristics. The domestic political conservatism and economic prosperity of the 1920s were intertwined. By moving away from liberal progressive reform movements centered on improving the lives of the working many, the country shifted towards conservatism geared toward fattening the pockets of the business-owning few. However, a decent amount of the economic boom did present itself among the middle class alongside the upper class. The Republican administration's policies of isolationism, disarmament, and high tariff protectionism were all meant to prevent the United States from becoming involved in international affairs as it had in World War I. However, these policies later allowed for the rise of Europe's dictators before World War II. Likewise, the raising of tariff rates in the United States prompted the raising of tariffs in other parts of the world, which contributed to the tragic fall of the Great Depression worldwide. Calvin Coolidge's straight-laced administration was quite a contrast with the corruption that ran rampant in his predecessor Harding's administration. Coolidge's administration showed a return to the Republican philosophy that the president was the high priest of the great god business, implying mutual respect, rather than the president being a doormat for business interests to walk all over. The international economic tangle of loans, war debts, and reparations was confusing and terrifyingly intertwined. The Dawes Plan, shown here, was very effective. Hoover fell from the status of the god of 1920s business to the god of Depression failure because the successful business boom bubble of the 1920s finally burst after his election. This burst resulted from the combination of the U.S.'s sky-high Hawley-Smoot tariff and a retaliatory tariff imposed by the British. Hoover originally believed that the government should completely distance itself from the stock market crash instead of passing out assistance to the citizens, but more lenient measures pursued. The government would bolster businesses such as railroads and banks in the hopes that the government help might trickle down to the masses through increased hiring and other measures. The rise of FDR to the presidency in 1932 was largely due to his soothing nature, which was much needed following the crisis of the Great Depression, his concern for the forgotten man, and the sweeping reforms that his platform contained. Eleanor Roosevelt was a pivotal aspect of the Roosevelt administration. She served as her handicapped husband's legs when visiting with the public and was able to connect with the citizens through radio, newspaper, and public speaking. The early New Deal had three main thrusts: relief, reform, and recovery. Relief to prevent further damage of or caused by the American economy allowed for the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and many others. Reform was to be based upon establishing permanent programs to prevent another depression in the future and included the Beer and Wine Revenue Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, and the Federal Securities Act. Recovery was centered on temporary programs to help jumpstart the economy and included the Emergency Banking Relief Act and the National Industrial Recovery Act. The NRA was designed to reorganize and reform U.S. industry through such measures as allowing workers to have their own bargaining representatives and initiating fair competition codes, which required self-restraint to be practiced by labor and management. The AAA was the New Deal farm agency that attempted to raise prices by paying farmers to reduce production of crops and animals. FDR became frustrated with the conservative Supreme Court because they blocked his progress in instituting his liberal New Deal program. His court-packing scheme failed because it shocked and offended Congress and the nation. This shock and offense caused conservative members of both parties of Congress to be less likely to accept his New Deal legislation, thus weakening the political momentum of the New Deal. Roosevelt mobilized a New Deal political coalition that included the South, Catholics, Jews, African Americans, and women in order to jumpstart their activity in putting the economy and the country as a whole back on its feet. Additionally, these groups would possibly be more likely to support FDR and his future political endeavors because he, in their eyes, was able to advance their status in the country, however minor.